Nail by Ian Jones and Andy Edwards. Episode 3, Edna. Wednesday, March the 25th, 1942. It's market day. Merv and Nail are in the ship inn, and talk is of Edna and her court case. The pub is empty. Most of the village is in town. Me and Merv, quiet in the snug, supping our first pint. Wednesday, is it? I ask Merv. Merv turns his head, ever so slowly towards me, makes eye contact. Aye, he says, and turns his head and stares back at the wall. All day, yeah? I ask. His head once again turns as slow as before, makes eye contact again. Aye, he says, and purposely adds, all day. Eirig Book and Pencil walks into the public bar in full uniform. Pint, Eirig? Asks Eddie, holding the glass in his hand ready to pour. I never drink on duty, Eddie, you know that. And he pauses. Not today, anyway. A cup of tea then, Eirig? Asks Eddie. Go on then, he replies. I'll tell you what. Put a tot of rum in it for me. Cold out there. Eddie disappears out back into his kitchen. All right, boys, he says to us. Have you seen the paper? God, I forgot about that. Is there trial in there, Eirig? I ask. Every gory detail, Eirig replies. I'll come in there now, boys, once I've had my tea. Eddie returns from the kitchen with Eirig's tea in a bright blue china mug, pours a large slug of rum into the cup and hands it to Eirig. I got that in Cardiff, says Eddie. What, the mug? Says Eirig. No, man, the rum from Jamaica. Eirig comes into the snug, puts his mug down next to my pint. Come on then, Eirig, tell us what happened, says Merv excitedly. Do you want to read it, Merv? No. Read it out, Eirig, says Merv. I ain't got my glasses. Says Eirig, and he ruffles the paper straight. 10 scenes at court as Black Widow poisoner trial concludes. He coughs, clears his throat and begins to read. There were 10 scenes at the Crown Court in Carmarthen today as the trial of the Black Widow poisoner Edna Thomas came to a dramatic conclusion. Bloody hell, it's like an Agatha Christie book, says Eddie. A large crowd had assembled to hear the verdict of the 12-man jury as the 3-week trial reached its dramatic conclusion. Maggie said Ellen John and Ella Prothero were there every day of the trial, knitting in the public gallery like the tricketers, at the guillotines. Judge asked them to stop knitting at one point. It was disturbing his concentration. They were most put out. I bet they were, says Eirig, and continues reading. The judge spent 3 hours summarising the evidence provided by both prosecution and defence, and he emphasised the validity of the forensic evidence against Mrs. Thomas, and praised, listen now, and praised a thorough police investigation. What's forensic evidence, Eirig? Eddie asks. Oh, it's where we assess evidence using scientific methods. All went to a laboratory in Cardiff, Eirig clarifies. Now, where was I? Right. It is physically possible that any of the deceased might have taken the arsenic themselves. But if we are to believe the evidence of Dr. Llewellyn Jones, then, unless each man was insane, this would be almost impossible. Guilty, says Merv. Hush, man, I say. Go on, Eirig. In the cases of all three of the deceased, there had been previous illnesses. It has been necessary to consider these as well, with a view to establishing whether they may be due to the same cause. Oh, they all had bad guts, didn't they, says Merv. Dr. Llewellyn Jones assures us that this would be consistent. He was there when I dug him up, see? Stood at the edge of the grave all day, he did. Never said a word. Eirig continues reading. It is physically possible that in some extraordinary way arsenic might have got into something they ate by accident. There again, if the three illnesses were due to arsenic, it is inconceivable that any such accident should happen a second, still less a third time. No bloody accident, says Merv. If it was not the men themselves, not an accident, then something else, or more likely, someone else was responsible. Aye, Edna, says Merv. It cannot be overlooked that arsenic was discovered in 3 separate locations in Mrs. Thomas's household, including the locked bedroom cupboard, to which, by her own admission, the late Mr. Thomas had no access. Oh, it's bloody obvious, says Merv. Shut up, man, says Eddie. You're spoiling it, man. Mr. Justice Evans spent about 3 hours on his summing up. He mentioned the many good character references provided for Mrs. Thomas, including from the Reverend Penderyn James of St. Ishmael's Church in Ponderw. Oh, he'll be glad he got a mention, says Merv. Aye, and Mrs. James, says Eddie. Eirig recaps. Reverend Penderyn James St. Ishmael's. Mrs. Thomas had listened intently throughout. It was only at this point that she wept, and sat for a while with her handkerchief to her face. Crocodile tears, says Merv. There are logically only 2 questions for the jury, said Mr. Justice Evans. The first is whether these men died from arsenical poisoning. Course they did, man, says Merv. And it is my firm belief that this question has been answered in the affirmative, beyond reasonable doubt. There you are, says Merv. Told you. And the second question is whether that poison was administered by the accused. This is the question which you must ask yourselves when reaching your verdict. Well, says Eddie, they hardly took it themselves, did they? 3 of them. Taking poison by accident? I can't believe she pleaded not guilty. Eirig continues reading. All morning the jury of 12 men had sat listening to Mr. Justice Evans reviewing the evidence for and against Mrs. Thomas. It was about noon when they filed out to the jury box to consider their verdict. Not much for them to consider, surely, says Eddie. About an hour later they returned under the eyes of a crowded court in an atmosphere of dramatic suspense. What was the verdict, Eirig? Merv asks excitedly. Let me read it now, and I'll tell you, Merv. Eirig is getting a bit frustrated with Merv's constant interruptions. I know, where was I? He looks back at the newspaper. Reviewing evidence, jury box, dramatic. Right, here we are. The jury names were called over. The clerk asked the chair, have you agreed on your verdict on all charges against the accused? Yes, came the reply. On the accusation of the murder of Harold John Jenkins, do you find the accused guilty or not guilty? And the answer came, guilty. Knew it, says Merv. On the accusation of murder of Albert Stanley Priest, do you find the accused guilty or not guilty? And again the answer came, guilty. Never in doubt, Merv jumps in again. And on the accusation of the murder of Howard Mary Thomas, Mary, says Merv. Howard's middle name was Mary? I don't believe that. That's a woman's name. Shut up, Merv, we all say loudly. On the accusation of the murder of Howard Mary Thomas, do you find the accused guilty or not guilty? And the answer came, Eirig makes a dramatic pause. Guilty, he says solemnly. Knew it, says Eddie, she's got a swing. Addressing Mrs. Thomas, the clerk said, you stand convicted of wilful murder. Have you anything to say why judgment should not be passed upon you? And Mrs. Thomas replied with emphasis, not guilty, sir. Bloody liar, says Eddie. The black cap was placed on Mr. Justice Evans's head. That's it then, I say. After a long, careful trial, Mr. Justice Evans said to Mrs. Thomas, you have been found guilty of the murder of your 3 former husbands. It remains only for me to discharge my duty, which is to pass sentence. The wages of sin are death, says Merv. And as the judge's voice went on in a quiet but clear tone, enunciating the words of the death sentence, the condemned woman stood with bowed head, and at the words, may the Lord have mercy on your soul. Ugh, says Eddie, can't believe it. The last thread of the composure which had sustained her during the long trial snapped. She collapsed into the arms of the wardresses beside her in the dock. As she was led from the dock, her high-pitched sobbing echoed throughout the hushed court. Serves her bloody right, says Merv. Poor Howard didn't have a chance. There's a bit more, says Eirig. After sitting in the dock for 3 weeks, Mrs. Edna Thomas left court under sentence of death for the murder of her 3 husbands, Harold John Jenkins, Albert Stanley Priest and Howard Mary Thomas, all of Ponterw, Carmarthenshire, by wilfully administering them arsenic. I can't believe that, says Merv. Ponterw in the Times of London newspaper. That's got to be a first. When you think she'll go to the gallows, Eirig? I'm not sure, says Eirig. There's still questions about her first husband in Cardiff. He's been exhumed as well, apparently. I like the bit about a thorough police investigation, no? He continues. Most people think we're just a bunch of bullies. Just goes to show, doesn't it? I think I'm going to head off, boys, I say. Bit upsetting, all this stuff. Think I'll go home to tell Maggie. Okay, see you later, shipmate, says Merv as I shut the door. Maggie is sitting at the kitchen table. I'm not condoning what she did, mind, says Maggie. It's horrible, unforgivable. But she confided in me once, about how things had been for her as a little girl. I struggle a bit with Maggie's perspective. She's killed 4 people, Maggie. Surely no matter what happened to her, it isn't Howard's fault. I know, she says, and I'm not making excuses, but she didn't have it easy. That's all I'm saying. Perhaps we just reflect what's happened in our own lives, huh? I'll keep quiet. She's lost me, really. Her grandfather, she goes on, abused her when she was a little girl. And her father was an angry, drunken lout who beat her mother, treated her so badly. I still don't respond. She pauses. Her mother died when she was 5, Hobart. She had a hard life, just like me in Llanedrid workhouse. It's not Howard's fault. I'm not making excuses for her, but maybe it's not just her to blame. That's all. I'll be honest. I don't really agree with or fully understand her argument. But she makes it in such reasonable terms that I find myself unable to argue against her point of view. Maybe her life experiences did turn her into what she became, I say. But that's not Howard's fault, or Albert, or Harold for that case. Fair enough, Maggie, but she's still gonna hang. From nowhere, as far as I can see, Maggie bursts into tears. Oh, come on now, Mag, I say, it's not worth that. I know, she sobs, but I hate it when people are judged without being understood. Just cast aside, not given a chance to explain anything. I hold her in my arms as she cries. My mother was just thrown away, cast out. She didn't do anything wrong, just fell in love. A moment in time. Is that what we are, Hobart? Just a moment in time, a flash in the pan? Ah, don't be soft now, Cariad, I say. I love you, Maggie Vach. Do you, Hobart? Do you? Of course, man. Don't be soft now. She squeezes my arm. Thanks, love, she sobs. Thanks.